Well, thanks very much for coming along, everyone. As you heard, my name's Nick Wright, and I run Atlassian's Site Reliability Engineering and Operations teams. Now, in my talk today, I want to start by mentioning a few specific problems that are encountered in operations teams. Problems that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. I then want to move on to site reliability engineering and how it helps. Now, it's a big step for us. We're going from being primarily a software-based company to one with a huge focus in cloud. And so it's a multi-year journey that we're making in building site reliability engineering. So in my talk today, I'd like to focus in particular on the very first SRE team that we've created, the process that we went through, and how we got it up and running. If you're in a situation similar to mine where you want to make these kind of changes in your business, then I'm hoping that our example will help set you in the right direction. The last part of my talk will cover how we've configured Atlassian tools to support our SREs and our operations teams as they handle incidents and postmortems across Atlassian. So great, let's get started. Now I wanted to just find out, first of all, who I've got in my audience here today. So hands up everybody who's currently in an operations team. It's great, that's a good few of you. Or anybody who's in a team that would be on call and paged out during an incident in your company. Yep, any SREs? Awesome, so a few people who already know this stuff, great. Now, I wanted to just take a moment to recognize the awesome work that you guys do. It's a role that's often somewhat less than glamorous in keeping the services that we know and love up and running. So a round of applause to all you operators working all that hard hours. And then I just want to take the temperature of how busy you guys are. So I'm going to be using the term incident to refer to an outage or a degradation of a service, anything that you guys will get paid for. So keep your hands up if in your company you're dealing with 10 or more incidents in any given month. That's pretty much everybody, right? Okay, so keep your hands up, so 100 or more. 400 or more? 900 or more? All right, still a few of you with your hands up. I've got to ask, how did you manage to come to Summit? Now, if you've been at that extreme end, or if you've ever been in a team that is at that extreme end, you know what this can feel like. It can be that sense of fingers in the dike, doing whatever it takes and working long, difficult hours to keep things up and running. All right, let's talk about the releases. Here's an idyllic picture of how a release might work. We have a couple of dev teams. They carefully stage their release into the pre-production environment. All the tests pass, and the release goes into prod. No problem. Does that seem like a likely scenario? Or is this a bit closer to the truth? We've got a large number of complicated and interrelated systems and a bunch of dev teams with changes queued up. We triggered the release and that doesn't look good. What's going on here? Something for the ops team to look at. Now, this is something that certainly feels familiar to me at times. And if you're from a team where you're dealing with many changes, things breaking, you can often find yourself feeling as though you're doing altogether too much firefighting and fixing the same things over and over again. And overall, this can lead to stress, some burnout, general sense that we may all aspire to be astronauts, and the reality may fall a little short. Now, this is a picture of what we had at Atlassian a year ago, before we started our journey towards SRE. We had a large operations team that we called Service Ops, and a bunch of app dev teams that would make changes into the production code. And I'll be completely honest with you guys here when I say that we were not entirely happy with the number of incidents we were dealing with on a monthly basis, or the pain that you, our customers, feel when even one of our services fails. In talking to my operators, I heard that there was a desire to go deeper, to prevent things from breaking in the first place. But with that widespread across all the different services we operated, they just did not have the capacity to go deep. So let's talk about site reliability engineering. Now, before I go into the detail, of course we've been hearing about SRE for a number of years now, from companies like Google, Facebook, Dropbox, and Spotify. Companies that operate at significant scale, make frequent changes to their production environments, yet still maintain a reputation for being highly available services. Now this year, a bunch of us from Atlassian went along to SRECon, and we met these people face to face, a bunch of SREs, we talked to some managers. It was awesome to hear about some new ideas that we wanted to try out. So what did we learn? Essentially, the idea is to create multiple teams who specialize in just one or a limited number of related services. Importantly, these teams go far deeper beyond the incident response process and diving into why things have happened and how to prevent them from happening again. Now, given the title of my talk, I'm sure many of you are curious to know what's the difference then between SRE and DevOps. And this can be somewhat of a contentious topic. Ask a dozen different people about what DevOps is, and you're probably going to get a dozen different answers. So I'll give you my take. Take it with a grain of salt, if you will. SRE is an operations function. DevOps people are often found on the delivery side behind new updates to existing services. Now, where is the SRE team? Very much on the incident response and diving into postmortems. People running in DevOps teams are often doing release automation or build-outs of new environments. There are a lot of similarities. The same techniques may be used by SREs in building out new monitoring or doing capacity planning, things like configuration management, infrastructure as code, but it's the primary focus that for me is the key differentiator. Reliability of specific services as opposed to delivery speed and facilitating updates. Solutions to the problem I described earlier. Firstly, that balance between interrupt incident work and preventative root cause analysis work. It's pretty simple, really. In SRE, we have a cap at 50% of any of the engineer's time dealing with incidents. If we ever find ourselves more busy than that, then we pull people out of the delivery team to grow the size of the ops team temporarily. That has the effect of packing the team big enough to really get on top of things and move things back to where they should be. Now, in order to achieve this, we need to make sure that we hire developers. Site reliability engineers are software developers. We need people who can deep dive into the application code and submit patches and fixes back to the products if needed. And we also need people to work closely alongside the delivery teams to make sure that features are built with the constraints of the production environment in mind. Things like the anticipated load for new features to work on, or the memory constraints that we may have. Things that, in Atlassian, we've been traditionally focused on building new features, releasing new updates. We haven't necessarily grown up with that run DNA in our software teams, and that's what bringing SREs in, we hope will change. Now lastly, and importantly, software developers are somewhat lazy. Repeated fixes, runbooks, as much as possible that can be automated to make sure that the team members are freed up to work on more important problems. Postmortems are a mandatory, always happen in SRE teams. In freeing up the time, the 50% time, that means that the rest of the time we can go in deep and figure out what to do. And in practice, really 1 or 2 incidents per engineer per shift is the limit here. Now lastly, those pre-release meetings where you get everybody together, the development team and the ops team, and you try and figure out whether or not the release is going to go ahead successfully and whether or not it's safe to push the button. Don't have these meetings. Site reliability engineers are pretty open about the fact that there are not pre-release meetings or change advisory boards, and the decision about whether or not to release is made in quite a different way. Establish an objective measure of service quality. It could be as simple as the uptime for the service, or it could be something like the overall percentage of 500 errors being served by the web app. Now, whatever means you choose, make sure that there's a standard or an SLA. As long as you're achieving the SLA, it's a green light for releases, no questions asked. But if you ever fall below, releases stop, and the only thing you can do is bug fix work. Now, this has an interesting effect. It changes where the risk sits around the release. Traditionally, this has been something that operations teams have been very focused on, but if you can broaden the focus across the entire delivery team, then behaviours start to change. Smaller and more frequent changes that contain the damage of a bad release to a relatively small set of the customer base is something that can significantly reduce the impact and therefore possibly stay within the SLA. Now, this all sounded really amazing to us, but it's a massive change to make to a company with an already established operations team and existing approaches in place. Going into this process, we had a whole bunch of questions about where to get started, and figuring out the answer to that was crucial before we had a consistent direction to go in. Questions like, how are we going to make our developers change the way they think about the release process? What SLAs can we use? Do we have any sensible ones already, and are we already hitting them? And who are we going to be able to hire for these teams? Now, you've heard a bunch about Project Central and the way that Atlassian tracks projects and the work that we do. And we treated the creation of our first SRE team as a project, like anything else. With a vision, build and improve cadence. Vision, be upfront. What are we going to do? How are we going to know we were successful? And build, get the team actually running. Improve, conduct the health checks that we've been talking about. Regularly check in with the team. Now, importantly, we didn't want to do this everywhere. As I mentioned, this was one team we were going to create. So we had to find a relatively small, self-contained set of services, and we chose the Atlassian Customer Portal and Provisioning Systems, collectively known as purchasing, which is where you guys, our customers, sign up for our products. Pretty important, really, that these services work. So we were taking a bit of a risk in doing this. But importantly, if we could demonstrate the value of this team in improving this critical part of the business, that would be a huge win. So let's go into a little bit of the detail. The responsibilities had to be defined up front. To do that, we had to figure out which services they would be working on and who owned those services. So something you would think would be pretty easy to figure out. But in long-standing and legacy systems that have changed hands a number of times over the years, the lines of responsibility had become somewhat blurred. And the old adage applied: shared responsibility means no responsibility. So once we'd pulled those people together, we could have a structured conversation around what the duties would be. Beyond incident management, we were looking at taking over some things like capacity planning in the environment, implementing new monitoring and alerting systems, and importantly, taking a significant stake in our disaster recovery test planning, which would, for these critical services, was something that we needed to make sure it was appropriately staffed. Now, in these discussions, we also tabled a number of ways that we might do that release gating that I was talking about, and we quickly realised with the monitoring systems we had in place, we just could not get the availability numbers in anything like the real time that we needed to be able to make those decisions in quickly. And that gave us some great initial goals and some ways that we could measure the success of the team. Obviously, we would be doing a replacement to the monitoring system within the first 6 months, and we would also implement a whole bunch of new DR tests that made sure that these systems were compliant. To measure how the team was successful, we looked at some pretty simple things. Were we able to reduce the number of incidents? Did we have good coverage of our post-incident reviews or postmortems for every incident that we dealt with? Lastly, how big would the team need to be? In order to answer this question, we had to make some guesses. As I said, the alerting systems were rather poor, and we were making a number of changes to the existing systems. So we had to just figure out approximately what we thought the numbers would be. And here's the team structure that we came up with. There were 3 permanent team members, a team lead, and then a monthly rotation from the development teams into our SRE team, which gave our devs exposure to a lot of the operational concerns that had been going on in these systems. And getting that commitment from our dev managers and our team leads to move our devs into this SRE team was a huge sign that we had that shared understanding across the whole group that we really wanted to care a lot more about reliability in these services. Now, moving on to build. Hiring people, it turns out, pretty hard. If I was to do this again, I would suggest we start earlier in the process, finding the people we needed, and importantly, involving them in some of those upfront discussions. These are the people going to be doing this work, and it's great to have them included. We looked at internal promotion opportunities, as well as the existing hiring pipeline. People who had applied for jobs at Atlassian for software roles maybe fell a little short on that, but had great backgrounds in either DevOps or systems engineering were great candidates for this team. Now, once we had them hired, we had to train them in both development and operations. A big change for us. Now, fortunately, Atlassian has a bunch of boot camps for all new starters who join dev teams, and we treated these guys as though they were dev new starters, which was good. Now, on the operations side, we had an exercise we called Wheel of Misfortune. Essentially, get the guys together, spin a wheel, choose a failure scenario that was something that we deal with, and then treat it as though it was a real incident, taking them through the process we used to resolve it, as well as the technical aspects. Lastly, we had to make sure that this new team had tools set up effectively. The alerts had to go to them, and we had a bunch of configuration changes to make in Confluence, HipChat, and JIRA. Now, I'll get into this in detail in the last part of my talk. Now, the health checks that I mentioned, checking in regularly with the team and make sure that the early decisions we'd made were right, whether we needed to make any changes, and importantly, picking up on some of the success stories that we'd had, things that we could blog to the rest of Atlassian and start getting people excited about this new approach we were trying. And here are some early headlines that we were able to put up. One particularly near and dear to my heart: purchasing team members get more sleep thanks to Ham's job reshuffle. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, we had a whole bunch of background processing tasks that were running at times where the load on the site was high. If we were able to radically reorganize the entire jobs so they always ran at times when there was less load on the site, and that significantly reduced the chance of an outage. And this was something that came on the back of a deep dive that the SRE team would do, something that we would never have had done in the previous situation. Now, we're 9 months now into this experiment, and I have some great results to share. Importantly, the number of incidents we deal with on a quarterly basis is down significantly since the team came into place. Now, you see, we actually had an initial uptick in the number of incidents. And the reason for that was that replacement for that monitoring system. It's not that there were more incidents, we just knew about more of them. And that was a great improvement. We've done 100% of the postmortems on all of the incidents we've dealt with in this team, which what I mean is we've gone through all of them, we've figured out what the fixes are. And the previous baseline number for this was at times as low as 20%. And we're completely DR compliant for Atlassian's DR policy across all of these systems. Now, it wasn't just the technical insights and changes that this team were able to make that were important to us. As I said earlier, we wanted to improve life significantly for the engineers in these teams. And I couldn't state it better than Andre, our dev manager, who says that the SRE team has pushed the entire group to lift their game on reliability. And James, one of our developers who rotates into the SRE team, loves the fact that we can truly get to root causes and fix them, rather than placing band-aid solutions. Now, in the last part of my talk, as I said, I wanted to cover how we've configured the Atlassian tools to support our operations teams. So let's look first at the incident process. And I should mention, we don't use any special version of Atlassian tools. We have the same versions available for all you guys. So I'm going to draw a diagram around the SRE team, starting with the alerts that we get from various different alerting systems. Because we've grown up somewhat organically, we have a number of different alerting systems, and rather than having to check all these individually, we feed a common dashboard that gives the SREs a view of what's going on. Now, alerts are pushed into an operations HipChat room. If the SREs happen to be asleep, certain alerts will wake them up via PagerDuty. Once that's happened, an incident ticket can be created in the operations JIRA. But it's worth noting that not all of our incidents we discover through alerts. Sometimes it's through a customer support ticket. Sometimes somebody just notices something not working. So we also have service desk configured company-wide so that anybody at Atlassian can trigger the incident process and get people looking. Now, once an incident is in flight, we want to move that noise out of the main chat room and get people working on it in a secluded spot. So we create a dedicated HipChat room, or what we refer to as a hot room, which is linked to the incident ticket, and that's where the investigation and fix work is tracked. Lastly, Confluence allows us to store a selection of runbooks for known failure scenarios so the operations team can get quickly up to speed and fix things. Now, I'm going to look at a few details from this diagram, starting with the link that we have between the operations JIRA and the announcements into the HipChat room. Now, this is done using the integration that we have between JIRA and HipChat, where you can specify a JQL rule. Any ticket that meets the JQL will be announced, given certain issue transitions or updates that you might specify. So that's really useful for us to know about new tickets that get created in JIRA that show up in HipChat. Now, the link between the incident ticket and the hot room, that dedicated HipChat room, is done in a different way. There's a plugin that's available in Marketplace, works on cloud, which allows you to create the HipChat room automatically and invite people to get involved in the incident ticket. And conveniently, it will save the chat history and add it onto the incident ticket at the end of the incident. Now, the ticket itself, you may be initially tempted to create a large, complicated workflow that will handle every eventuality. Now, for us, that didn't work particularly well, and instead, we went for the simplest possible thing. An incident is a thing that happens very rapidly, and often what would happen is that the JIRA ticket would fall out of date. So by simplifying the process, we just made life easier for ourselves, in that we were not using all the different statuses we had. In determining the severity of an incident, we take a couple of key factors into consideration. How many of our customers are impacted, and how severely are they impacted? On the creation of every ticket, we prompt our engineers to fill in these fields by having custom fields before they then go ahead and specify the severity. On the timeline of any incident, there's a number of different milestones that we were interested in reporting on. Something fails. We then detect it somehow, and then the team responds and eventually closes the incident ticket. And at some point along the timeline, they actually apply the fix. Now, these were all things we wanted to be able to create metrics around: time to resolve, time to detect, time to respond, those kinds of things. So we created a bunch of custom fields, and we were able to automatically populate these fields in many cases using automation from our alerting systems, which was great for reporting. Now, postmortems. Once the incident has been resolved, we had a couple of ways to track our postmortems, in Confluence and in JIRA, and we've tried both. So I'll talk about Confluence first. We were able to use Confluence blueprints to create a structured page in which all of the key questions we wanted to ask were asked, and we were able to use the JIRA issues macro to track the follow-up activities. So here's an example of a Confluence post-incident review that we've done, which, as you can see, has a specific structure and a bunch of summary data. And then towards the bottom, we've got our actions tracked as JIRA issue links. Now, this is great, except that if you notice, there's a slight problem here. Most of these are JIRA issue links, but one of them isn't. As Atlassian has scaled, with the free-form nature of Confluence, we found it was a little bit difficult to make sure that everybody tracked everything in the same way, and that was difficult for our reporting process. Which is what caused us to move over to looking at JIRA instead, where we can be far more prescriptive about the way we link our post-incident review tickets and the follow-up actions associated with them. Not only that, but we were able to create a dedicated workflow in JIRA for the post-incident review process itself, breaking open that reviewing step that we had in the incident ticket. Now, as we've grown and as we anticipate creating new SRE teams where we're going to have multiple streams ongoing of post-incident reviewing, multiple follow-up actions tracked, it became really important for us to do a bunch of reporting off this, which JIRA has allowed us to do with a dashboard to show the status of all the incidents and whether they've been reviewed correctly, as well as a dashboard for the follow-up actions that are associated with that downtime. That's been really great to have that. And here's an example of a post-incident review ticket in JIRA, and as you can see, we've created a whole bunch of custom fields to replicate the structure we had in Confluence. Now, in summary, I've explained to you a bunch of the key problems that we've been dealing with. Essentially, the problem of far too much firefighting and an inability of the team to dive into the root causes and drive fixes. I've talked about SRE and how it resolves some of these problems, and the long-term view for us is to certainly go down the path of creating more SRE teams. And in going through the detail of how we created the very first SRE team at Atlassian, the process we followed and how we've configured the tools to support the work they do, I hope that I've given you guys a leg up on any journey you're taking towards a similar goal. If you want to find out more, we have this blog post up on the Atlassian Help Desk site, which covers SRE in more detail than I've been able to in this talk. And I'd also recommend checking out Ben Traynor from Google and Pedro Canawati from Facebook. both of whom have got very detailed talks available online about how SRE was implemented in those companies. I recommend taking a look. And that's my talk. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you, fantastic job. So I saw a lot of people taking screenshots with their phones. As a reminder, this entire presentation is available on SlideShare, so you can check it out on the Summit website on atlassiansummit.com. So we actually have time for a few questions.
Right.
The first question is an interesting one. And you mentioned you wanted to hire devs for operation roles. How do you do that?
So that's been pretty challenging. We have a number of different hiring streams for Atlassian. You can apply online. We've got a site. Or we sometimes get our recruiters to go out and sort of tap people on the shoulders. And we had to work very closely with the recruiters to make sure that we understood the role that we were filling was quite different from the one we'd previously been filling. So we changed the job description and we made sure it was very clear. We included a lot of the things from our developer job spec. Java was important for if we were going to create a JIRA specific SRE team. But we don't use Java everywhere, so it was important to be able to look for things like Python and various other programming languages. We did have to tailor a little bit in terms of which type of development skills we would be focusing on for specific dev teams.
A similar question. So instead of hiring devs to be on the operations team, what do you think of asking developers to take more ownership of the code they build?
Well, see, I think that's a great position to be in. And one of the things we found talking to folks at SRECon is that there's various different sort of implementations of SRE out there, some of which have dedicated teams that you hire, is sort of the example that we followed from Google. But other companies promote very much a you build it, you run it mindset, where the developers do own that full responsibility. At Atlassian, we're thinking that we would like to get to that position, but we're sort of a long way away from there. So I think the building of these teams is an important first step that we're going to take by putting these groups together, but still keeping them separate.
Do you look at tickets generated through Service Desk, and do you use those to improve your monitoring?
What was the second part?
Do you use those to improve your monitoring?
Yes, we absolutely do. So a lot of our alerts still come to us via Service Desk, and that always tells us that if somebody had to tell us about it, then clearly the monitoring didn't pick up on it. So in any case where we've had an incident come that way, we know that we need to do some monitoring improvements if possible. Now that can be extremely challenging at times. There are some very sort of specific types of monitoring that you sometimes need to implement, and some very specific use cases that can get triggered in our production environment. You guys use our tools in millions of different ways. So creating sort of general purpose monitoring for all of it is pretty challenging, and we're working on that at the moment.
How did you automate the link between monitoring tools and the custom time fields in incident tickets?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, that hasn't always been possible. And what we've done is we have a system that I didn't talk about in detail. It's something that we've been working on internally, where every alert that comes in creates a record in a database, and it has timestamps associated with it. So we've been able to receive basically all of the alerts. That's how we do alert management. And then some of those alerts will generate incident tickets. So if we can get the timestamps from the sort of the down alert and the up alert and match them up and associate the incident ticket with those, which is at the moment a manual process, then we can have the system go through and then auto-populate a whole bunch of JIRA tickets. So that was a time-consuming, cumbersome process that's now considerably easier.
The last question is about the postmortem process. So after you complete your postmortem and you have your action items, how do you ensure ownership and that people follow up on those action items?
Yeah, that is actually really tricky. I mean, you have to get the commitment, and I'll come back to the point that I mentioned about service ownership. So we've made it very clear to all of the people at Atlassian, if they're responsible for a service, they need to commit to driving those things through to completion. There's very little point in us doing, in the operations side, all of that work around figuring out what the root cause was and how to prevent it, if nothing ever comes of it. So we get a sign-off process in our PIR ticket. Every PIR has to be signed off by that owner, and that essentially triggers, like, it signals a commitment that will end up in a backlog, and it'll get tracked. We also put we put sort of reporting around how long our actions are taking to get done, and we can report on that too. So we're sort of driving adoption. But look, it's a big challenge, and it's not something that's always smooth sailing for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.